Hola, buenos días a todos. Soy Yasmín Ríos. Pues es un honor para mí presentar a Laura Albert, que nos va a dar la plenaria del día de hoy. I will introduce a little bit of you, Laura, in Spanish, and then I will let you give your talk in English. It will be in English today. Bueno, entonces les quería yo platicar un poco, que es un honor para nosotros tener a Laura Albert de la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison aquí con nosotros, de Estados Unidos. Se puede hablar mucho de Laura Albert, es toda una investigadora muy conocida en Estados Unidos en esta área de investigación de operaciones. Ha ganado numerosos premios como el Informs Impact, Fulbright and Career de la NSF. Y bueno, les dije que ha ganado muchos premios. Su investigación es acerca de hacer modelos matemáticos y resolver problemas de optimización discreta que tengan aplicaciones en la seguridad nacional, por ejemplo, en cosas médicas, servicios públicos, servicios de emergencia. Además de esa investigación que la ha llevado a los más altos niveles, también es editora del e-Transactions y bueno, también sirve como, bueno, está en los boards o en los comités de otras journals, de otros artículos, de otras revistas. Además de todo eso, Laura pues ha tomado muy en cuenta su labor de que es un ejemplo, una mujer a seguir. Entonces les recomiendo ver sus blogs. Uno se llama Punk Rock Operations Research y bueno, y tiene varios más. Otro que se llama Badger Bracketology. Bueno, so dear Laura, thank you so much for accepting being today with us. It's really nice to have you. We have a lot of people wanting to hear your talk. So you can start. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction today. I'm just going to get a little situated here with the slides. Today, I'm going to talk about academic research with impact, giving some examples from my research in public sector operations research. I'm going to start by saying buenos dias desde Madison, Wisconsin, Estados Unidos. I'm here. I wish I was with you all in Mexico today. But a virtual visit is also quite nice. As I prepared for this keynote, I've been thinking about how you have all been through so much, as have I, these past couple of years. And there are huge societal challenges that we need to solve. And operations research and analytics can definitely play a role. We're seeing how important they are. You've seen how interconnected our world is and how these interconnections matter in terms of the global supply chain, vaccine delivery, and just the spread of disease. We've also seen data play such a big role in helping us understand these challenges and also serve as a resource to solve them. And operations research and analytics has the tools that are really useful that can make a difference, especially if we partner with others. So I wanted to motivate my talk by just outlining the potential that we have as a discipline. I'm excited about that. I wish we didn't have a global pandemic right now, but we do have a great opportunity to make a difference. So with that foundation, I want to introduce the roadmap for the rest of my talk. It will be in 3 parts, and the overall theme is how operations research and analytics can make a difference. I'm going to start by briefly talking about how operations research connects to decision making, and then I'll move into the second and main part of the talk, which is about doing good research. So this will be some stories from my research and how I've had some impact with some of the work that I've done. And at the end, I'll wrap things up by outlining some avenues for influencing policy and practice and making a difference. I've studied a number of applications in my research. Most of them have been in public sector operations research. I've studied public sector applications in fire and emergency medical services, or EMS. I've studied aviation security policy. I've studied policing and illicit opioid network interdiction. and a number of topics in infrastructure protection involving resilience and cybersecurity. I'll mainly be talking about my research in public sector OR and public safety. And I want to start by outlining how important our research is and that we have a model-centric discipline. We use a lot of mathematical models and systems thinking, and we often apply optimization to those math models, but we use other tools as well. And I just want to make the case that this is a value that our discipline has. It really helps us not only understand the world, but how to navigate the world and to engineer better systems. And on the bottom of my slide, I have a picture. It's a portion of my Twitter followers. And you can see from this example that there's a lot of structure there. And a lot of our models take advantage of that structure and turn that structure into opportunities for making improvements and operating systems more effectively. On the upper right is an SIR model for modeling the spread of disease. So the blue line is susceptible individuals. The orange line is the infected individuals, and the gray line is the resistant individuals. And you may have seen these types of models in the news and just in the public discourse a lot lately. And they really help us understand, but also predict what interventions will look like in terms of controlling or not controlling the spread of disease. And so these math models are all around us, and they really help us navigate the world. In operations research, we have a very model-centric discipline, and we're also often studying systems with interconnected parts. So you might have seen these toys that are slinkies. I have a couple myself, and they illustrate the concept of these interconnections in systems. So I wanted to start by defining a system, which is a set of things, which is often people, ambulances, computer networks, or vehicles that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own behavior over time. So an example is that one car is just a vehicle, but a bunch of cars can be a traffic jam. And in operations research, typically these systems span people, resources, and processes. So they can be multidimensional. And the slinky is here because you cannot make decisions in isolation. If you make one decision, it can have ripple effects throughout the system. And this is because there are interconnected decisions. And so if you move one part of the slinky, the rest of the slinky also moves because it's interconnected. So far I've talked about models and system thinking, and I haven't talked so much about data. Of course, data is very important for what we do, but the data are just the data. It's what we do with it that makes all the difference. And quite often in our discipline, we turn that data into information so that it's useful. And then we apply advanced analytics to that information and data and turn it into better decisions. And this is where the slinky comes back again, because this is where we look at the interconnections. And so all of these ideas will be kind of underlying some of the main themes in my talk. And it really is the opportunity and the value proposition that operations research has for making a difference. All right, so I want to move on to talking about my research. And I will start by talking about my emergency medical service research. And usually this starts with a 911 call. And I believe 911 is the number in Mexico as well to place calls. And it starts with an emergency. And then typically a call is placed. And this is handled by the call center, where they may do some triage to figure out what the patient needs and then send the appropriate vehicles. Once vehicles are dispatched, this is typically the part where I start the modeling and I look at what the service provider is doing. So that vehicle leaves to the call, they arrive at the scene, they provide care, then they leave the scene with the patient, arrive at the hospital, and transfer the patient. And all of this takes quite a long period of time. Throughout the world, emergency medical service systems typically evaluate performance in terms of response times. They look at other performance goals as well, but this is one main criteria for how they evaluate their performance. The service is typically non-preemptive. So when the vehicle is sent to a call, it's unavailable for a long period of time and it can't be rerouted. So this is a challenge. You have to make decisions. You have to make good decisions up front. And of course, there are interconnections here. So the interconnections occur across time, but also space, because the ambulances and vehicles are located geographically on a network. So I want to take you on a journey through some of my research here, and I'm going to start with how I initially started approaching the problem. I started working with an agency. They were very generous in terms of sharing their data and expertise, and I shadowed them. I analyzed the data. I talked to different service providers, and the goal was to respond to 80% of calls within 9 minutes, which is a pretty typical goal. And they were also pretty far from meeting that goal. And they didn't have any extra resources that they could really use. They had to operate within their budget. And I had a fascinating conversation with the medical director, who is a medical doctor who does not work for the agency. He just oversees the kind of the medical treatment part of it. And, he really caused me to start thinking about this in terms of patient outcomes and taking a patient-centered approach instead of just looking at response times. And he noted that, many of the patients are cardiac arrest patients or other types of patients where every minute counts. And for cardiac arrest patients, their survival may decrease about 10% a minute. And so fast response times can be really critical. But just getting there at any time under 9 minutes isn't really great. So he started drawing this picture on the back of an envelope, and it looks something like this. And this is the cumulative distribution of the actual response times. And he noted when they get there within 9 minutes, it's just before the 9-minute mark, like maybe 8 minutes or so. And he said, this is not great for patient survival if you look at cardiac arrest patients. And instead, he drew this alternative line, which is what he proposed, which is a hypothesis about what if they had a 5-minute response time goal, then somehow magically they'd appear a minute before that goal and more patients would survive. And I agreed, like, this is what we want in theory, but the question is, how do we get there? And this led to some initial research in the area. So the point was, we can't just turn a dial and crank up performance. That's not how any of this works. Instead, we have to look at the interconnections and look at the decisions we can influence, kind of looking under the hood, so to speak, and seeing what we can do to make a difference on that overall objective. And so that is the approach I take with my research. The county at the time, so the Emergency Medical Service Department, had some ideas they could try. And this was really exciting for me as a researcher. Their hypothesis was that changing the vehicle mix would provide an opportunity to provide faster service. And they had 2 main types of ambulances that provide different levels of care. Basic life support ambulance, which is an ambulance with 2 emergency medical technicians on it. They also had some advanced life support ambulances, which is also an ambulance, but one of those service providers is a paramedic who can provide a lot more medical care at the scene. So these ambulances are not really interchangeable. What they wanted to do was to add a 3rd vehicle to the mix, which is a non-transport vehicle with just a single paramedic. So it would provide that higher level of care that's really critical for certain types of patients. The problem, as you might guess, is that it can't take patients to the hospital, which is pretty important. So the question here is, can changing the vehicle mix improve performance? Well, I started to answer that question with optimization. I want to illustrate the implications because the answer to that question is not at all obvious. So let's say we have a call and we think the patient might need that higher level of service from the ALS vehicle. What we'd have to do is we'd have to dispatch both vehicle types, the ambulance and the non-transport vehicle, and we'd tie up 3 service providers here. They'd arrive at the scene and provide care. And at this point, the paramedic would make an assessment and see if what the patient really needed. Quite often, the patient didn't really need that advanced care. And the ALS vehicle with the paramedic can be freed up and returned to service, while the ambulance takes the patient to the hospital. If it turns out that that paramedic was actually needed, then both vehicles take the patient to the hospital. And in practice, this means the paramedic just hops onto the ambulance and they all drive together. But this ties up more service providers. Okay, so it's kind of inefficient. So there are pros and cons to this approach. The pros is that you always send the right type of vehicle to the call because you send both types of resources. You also have more vehicles because some of your vehicles only need a single employee on them. And so if you have more vehicles, you can spread them out and use that as an opportunity to reduce response times. The downside is that there's more multiple response. So the vehicles are busier and they might not actually be available. And another challenge is that the decisions are no longer obvious. So you need some optimization to shed some light on when to send what type of ambulance and when to send multiple response. But that opened up some opportunities for research. So the question, should we replace an ambulance with 2 non-transport vehicles, is yes. So I worked on my first paper in this area, and it developed a new integer programming model that had a few novel features, including multiple types of vehicles, including non-transport vehicles, which was very novel at the time and is actually still novel. And it also took a patient-centered care approach to looking at performance. So I published that paper, and as I mentioned before, these research questions opened up and at least shed light on some knowledge gaps in the literature. So there was some follow-up work, some of which was published just this past year. I'm happy to say that the Emergency Medical Service Department implemented the results, and although not exactly, the actual implementation was a little political, but they did start using 3 non-transport vehicles. And when we started collecting data and looked at performance compared to the year prior with the same amount of resources in the system, there was a 5% increase in calls that were responded to in less than 9 minutes, which is an enormous increase without adding any extra resources to the system. So that was really exciting. The Emergency Medical Service Department applied for a National Association of Counties Award and won it, and actually won the best in category for across the whole country. So that was really cool. And we published the results in Interfaces. I want to revisit that question the medical director raised about the response times, because I too questioned the 9-minute response time goal. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Excuse me. It's pretty clear from the medical research that you need much faster response times to save lives. The question is, does that actually make sense for the system? So if you have a 9-minute response time goal, it looks like this in terms of the utility. It's a step function. You get full credit for the call if the response time is under 9 minutes, and then it drops to 0 once you hit 9 minutes. A 5-minute response time goal would look similarly, but the step function would drop down to 0 at 5 minutes. And what that means in practice is that if you switch to a 5-minute response time goal, the responses between 5 and 9 minutes would no longer really count. And at this point, a couple years into the collaborations, it was clear to me that the agencies would do things very differently if you change that response time goal. So the question is, we could consider a bunch of different response time thresholds. They all have the same shape, just they drop down at different points. And we want to look at which one is best for the system. And here we can look at patient survival or retrospective patient survival to assess how well these different goals correlate with patient survival. So I wrote a couple papers in this area, and I'm going to show you one of the graphs from the paper. So we're trying to here minimize excess deaths, because we looked at a number of different scenarios where we would try to a number of different scenarios, and you could just save more lives than others across the different scenarios. And so each scenario is a different line on this graph. And the x-axis has these different response time goals. And one thing should be clear is that there's a nice shape to these different functions. And in both papers, we found similar results like this. There's kind of a sweet spot in the middle. And the best response time threshold is 8 minutes across all of the scenarios. And this was held pretty consistently, very consistently. You'll also see that the 9-minute response time threshold is pretty good. It's almost as good as 8 minutes. And this was a big shock because it's really out of step with the medical literature. But the medical literature is asking a different question. It's looking just at single patients, and it's noting that to save lives, it's great to have really short response time goals, but that's not a really helpful goal for the overall system. And if you're setting a goal for the system, it's like setting up a rule so that you can enable the most lives saved in the system. And 8 or 9 minutes in that case is a really good goal for the system. If you look at the response time goals are 4 or 5 minutes, they do quite poorly. And this is because what happens is it leads to many extended response times in the patients that just can't be reached in 4 or 5 minutes. Suppose it like gives up on too many patients that could otherwise be saved with response times of 7 or 8 minutes. So this was really interesting research, and it also convinced me that these response time thresholds can be used to measure performance instead of patient survival, but you have to choose the right one. It has to be about 8 or 9 minutes. There are many collaborations with this agency and other agencies, and I won't go through all the details, but I'll summarize some of them. One is that there is and I did a lot of data analysis on call volumes, performance, volunteer shifts, stuff that I didn't publish, but it was very useful to the agencies and it helped inform some of their decisions. I also met with county administrators to talk about some of the insights from the data, mostly to justify requests for extra funding. In general, though, I think the best benefit was this validation from academia. We're seen as academics, as unbiased experts that have something to offer, but we're not necessarily selling anything to the people that we work with, except I'm selling them the idea that operations research and analytics are really useful, but that they're pretty receptive to that idea. The collaborations were impactful for me too. It provided data and for case studies, domain knowledge for doing the research. I was able to identify knowledge gaps and then do research to kind of fill those gaps. And I've published 26 papers and counting so far. And I was able to obtain grant funding. And of course, I was able to give conference talks like this one. I've asked a number of questions in my research. I've talked about which performance measures make sense for improving patient outcomes. I've also studied location and dispatch questions, especially when triage is imperfect. And this is because so many of those decisions are made upfront, and then there's a commitment made to those resources. I've also studied how to locate and dispatch ambulances in tiered systems with a mixture of vehicle types, including non-transport vehicles. My main tool is discrete optimization and integer programming, but I've tried to use the right tool for the job, including stochastic programming sometimes. Also Markov decision process models for studying dispatch decisions, and occasionally spatial queuing and discrete event simulation. So it's been quite a journey. I want to illustrate some of the research findings with pictures. And I'm going to first, and all of these examples focus on dispatch questions. And I first want to illustrate why maybe heuristics like sending the closest vehicle isn't always optimal. So in this case, we have some vehicles located on a network, and let's say a call arrives and it's a low priority call. If we send the closest vehicle and that ambulance takes the patient to the hospital, a large part of the region is left without a nearby ambulance. And if that ambulance is critical, it's likely that a high priority patient could arrive and there's no nearby ambulance. And so in this case, we'd have to send a more distant ambulance, and that could lead to a long response time that would be bad for the patient. Instead, if we use analytics and build predictive models and also prescriptive models, we can have this low priority patient, but in this case, the best solution might be to send a slightly more distant ambulance to that patient so that we're more enabled to respond quickly to future high priority patients that could arrive. So in this case, we do have a nearby ambulance and this patient has a better outcome. I alluded to multiple response sometimes being best. I've had more to say on that in follow-up research. And in this case, we can make a seemingly inefficient decision, such as sending both an ALS and BLS ambulance to a patient so that it enables a recourse decision of freeing up the ambulance we don't need. In this case, it's really critical to free up our paramedic ALS ambulances when possible. So if this patient turns out not to need that ALS care, that advanced care, we can free up the ALS ambulance, and then that ambulance is more likely to be available or is actually available to treat other patients that could arrive. So making inefficient decisions, if they lead to this recourse that could be good for the system, is something that we quite often want to do. I've also studied how to send non-transport vehicles to a patient. And in this case, a non-transport vehicle, such as this fire engine, could arrive first, stabilize the patient until an ambulance arrives that can take the patient to the hospital. I've also studied fire systems, and these are a little bit different in that when a fire occurs, and it's a serious fire, the protocol is to send multiple fire engines instead of a single ambulance. So we send multiple vehicles. What often happens, at least at what I've observed in the data, is that their service times are extremely correlated. And so they're likely to free up at exactly or almost exactly the same time. And so we can't treat these as like independent service times. And this was a gap in the literature. And so I worked on a paper that's estimated performance with these correlated service times. And I just did that research because it was really interesting to me and published it because I filled this a research gap and was very pleasantly surprised that somebody read the paper, and it was a software company, and they wanted to incorporate the algorithm into their software to route fire engines in Canada. And that was pretty cool. So I was really happy about that. And I think the takeaway here is to do good research that's interesting. You don't need an implementation plan necessarily. If you do good research and fill those knowledge gaps, that's an opportunity for somebody else to run with it. So far, all of my research has ultimately studied response times in one form or another. And response times are important, of course. They can be a matter of life or death for many patients. They also can be important for containing fires because fires spread quickly. They're also just really important for customer service. I've given a lot of talks, and I can tell that people are unhappy when they have to wait a long time for a fire engine or police officer. So response times are important in general, but they don't tell the whole story. And after years of doing research in public safety, I was really interested in studying the next challenge. And when I talked to service providers and did some ride-alongs, it was clear that there were some additional challenges. And in particular, the opioid epidemic in the United States has really impacted public safety agencies. The overdose deaths and just overdoses in general have really increased in the past generation. It started with this purple wave, which is wave 1, which is the rise in prescription opioid deaths. And then wave 2 in orange here is the increase in heroin deaths, which is the second wave. It started about a decade ago, in part in response to more regulation with prescriptions. And the third and steepest increase has to do with synthetic opioids. And we're just a few years into this third wave. And there's just a massive supply of synthetic opioids, and fentanyl is the most common, that have really flooded the market and led to an increase in overdose deaths. And this is incredibly tragic. And sadly, it's gotten worse during the pandemic. So in just a single year, opioid deaths increased by 36% in the United States, which is a tremendous increase. And I'm not a medical doctor. The medical doctors that work in this area have told me that opioid use disorder is a disease of despair and loneliness. And there's a lot of despair and loneliness right now. So this is a major challenge. So all of those overdoses lead to a big increase in workload for public safety agencies. And over time, we'd like to see communities become healthier. We'd like to see fewer overdoses. And of course, response times are not really the right metric to look at that if we're looking at seeing improvements in community health over maybe a generation. I specifically started working with police in this area because they're so often first responders. And there's also follow-up crime and drug-related crime associated with the overdoses. And so if you put it all together, there's this massive societal expense. So some of those crimes result in arrests, then people enter the criminal justice system, and maybe they go to drug courts, maybe there's incarceration down the road, but the expenses increase over time. The good news is that there is a path towards seeing an improvement here, and that is treatment. There's growing research showing that treatment, especially medicated assisted treatment, is helpful. And what's interesting here is that police officers often serve as first responders, and they have this opportunity to route drug users into treatment. But it's not so simple. It takes work. They need partner agencies. And they actually need to be able to route people to good treatment plans through their partner agencies. And the hope is that if that works, that it will decrease some overdoses, but also decrease the repeat crimes and incarceration down the road. So there's huge downstream effects that can be really positive if that works. Locally, the Madison Police Department has been running what's called the Madison Addiction Recovery Initiative, or MARI. And it's a diversion program since they're diverting drug users into treatment. And it starts typically with an encounter with a police officer that usually is an arrest. And so that is an opportunity to route, to recommend treatment or divert the users to treatment. And so what happens is that person that was arrested would call a counselor for an assessment, and that counselor would do an assessment and also find an appropriate treatment plan and possibly assign a recovery coach. The user would then comply with their addiction treatment. Many of them are already in treatment plans. They have to maybe go more regularly or just stick with the plan that they're already doing. And they have to comply for 6 months. And if they comply, then what happens is that charges are dropped. So that initial arrest completely disappears. And so this is a big benefit for actually doing the treatment and completing the treatment plan. The question is, does that work? We'd like to see a decrease in overdoses, a decrease in crime, or at least arrests, and over time, an improvement in community health. So we've started to study the data. The data looked promising initially, but it's just correlations. And one of the challenges is that the participants aren't randomly assigned. We can't really get to that underlying causality directly. So we started to assess this in terms of repeat crimes, which is something that can be observed on a shorter time frame. And the good news is that the answer seems to be yes. If we apply causal inference, this seems to reduce 6-month recidivism, which is repeat arrests. And this was just published this summer. So this is very promising research, and we're going to use this and build on this to understand how this could influence a community's health over a longer time frame. I want to move to the final part of my talk, which is about the impact that we can have. Of course, during my talk, I've mentioned some of the impact the research can have more directly. At the center of this is doing good research. It's always important to to center our research in terms of the impact. But there's different flavors of impact that we can have. Of course, we can influence practice, and I've talked about that in my talk. We can also influence policy, which I've also talked about a little bit. Our research can also influence legislation. We can also educate the public by doing public outreach and talking with the media. I want to mention, at least overview, some of the impact my research has had for social good. I've mentioned that one of my algorithms is in software to route fire engines. My research from a policy perspective has supported the adoption of non-transport vehicles in emergency medical services. I also serve on the Wisconsin EMS board, which is a government board that advises the governor of Wisconsin on legislation issues and new policy. I didn't talk about my aviation security research today, but that research made policy recommendations regarding risk-based security and was used by the Transportation Security Administration to select TSA PreCheck over its alternatives. My police research is just getting started, but it's already helped support the expansion of diversion programs in the area, which has been really positive. I also serve as a police commissioner on my local police commission. And I didn't talk about my cybersecurity research, but I currently serve on a cybersecurity consortium that's seeking to develop industrial standards for kind of managing risk in large-scale projects. In the past couple of years, I've seen operations research and analytics in the news a lot, and it's been great. I personally have always participated in media outreach in my career, and I've had a lot more opportunities the past couple of years, as well as others in the discipline. The public is really hungry to learn about analytics and how it affects their everyday lives, particularly on pandemic-related topics, but other topics as well. And I think it's great to just build public trust by talking to the media. It's provided a lot of great opportunities for the discipline. I'll give a couple of pieces of advice, I guess, on working with the media. I'd encourage you to take advantage if you have the opportunity. One thing that I will say is that the news moves really fast, and so we have to move fast with it. Sometimes when we get a call, we have to be ready to go to talk in a couple hours or a couple of days. So we have a very small window of opportunity to disseminate our research impact. The last time I was on television was 2 days ago. I ended up getting an email right at the end of my day on Monday, and they wanted me to appear on the evening news, and I had some plans with family in the evening. So I said I could talk to the reporter immediately. And in 20 minutes, I was recording a news segment on Zoom to go on the evening news later on. So it really does move fast. When I talk to the media, I don't just read my abstracts from my papers. I have to repackage my message for public consumption. This is a bit of a craft. I've gotten better over time. But I try to break down our research findings or our insights from operations research and analytics to smaller chunks. And I always ask myself, what do the readers or viewers want to learn from me, and what's new to them? And quite often the topics are not new to me, but they're new to the audience. And I try to repackage the messages for public consumption. And I usually come away with 1 to 3 things, no more, to discuss with the public. Media outreach comes in many flavors. So if you're interested, I wanted to outline some of the ways I've done media outreach. The most common way I've worked with the media is just to serve as an expert, a technical expert on a topic, typically for a newspaper article. So I often talk about aviation security. And there was an article in the Washington Post earlier this year where I was an expert. I've been on the news. So this is a picture when I would appear on the news in person live. Mostly it's Zoom these days. I've often been on the radio. This is a picture in front of the studio. I've been on podcasts to talk in my research, and technical podcasts typically allow me to go more in depth into the technical topics, which is pretty rewarding for me. One of my public talks was recorded and is available on television. So I took a picture of my TV where my talk was being aired. And in the past couple of years, I've been proactive and have written op-eds where I can more influence the conversation, especially about policy implications that come from my research. And I published 6 op-eds in the last year and a half. I would argue that operations research and analytics should not be a well-kept secret. It's important for us to get the word out. There are some benefits. First of all, people are really curious and they want to learn something new. But also getting the word out is really important for us as academic researchers. It helps people support higher education, and it also helps people support funding for scientific research. They want to hear the so what when their tax dollars are going to scientific research. And we should tell our stories. It's really good for long-term support of higher ed and science funding. And of course, it helps us get the word out about all the great things we do as a discipline. And it really does help draw new people to the field. So I want to wrap up my talk on a positive note that, of course, we can make a difference with operations research and analytics. I talked a lot today about managing these interconnected decisions and that we have really great tools and models for doing that effectively. But it's not just the models and our research results that make a difference. Sometimes we make a difference by introducing new ideas. And this is where we've really been able to influence policy. And for me, that's been a rewarding part of doing research. Even when people don't take my research results exactly, sometimes these new ideas really make a difference in the application. And of course, we're very optimistic. We believe we can make a difference, and we have a great track record of actually making a difference. And I'm very optimistic about our future of operations research. So muchas gracias. Thank you for coming to my talk, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this great talk. It was very interesting for us. Here in Mexico, let me tell you that we are just dealing with this problem. We want to be heard by the government, by the universities, by the enterprises, and we are trying to make a difference in all the aspects of operations research. Thank you so much. We have some questions in the chat, and also you can raise the hand. The public can raise the hand and ask questions for Laura. If you want to make questions in Spanish, I will try to translate them to Laura. So we have specific questions. So I will start with Federico Trigos. He asked you why do you take in, I think it's in the ambulance problem, the response time as a goal? Whether, I don't know, are there other, you mentioned that there are some objectives?
Yeah, so I think that looks like from the timestamp on that question that maybe I answered that during the talk. And I've been very skeptical about that as well. And in fact, one of the innovations from my research is to take a more patient-centered approach instead of just looking at response times. And that's been, I think, helpful in terms of moving the research forward. When you have different types of vehicles that respond, you can't just look at response times. And I didn't get into all of the details about that in the talk. It's about getting the right type of resource to the patient as well. And so taking that patient-centered approach definitely leads to some challenges, but also opportunities for improvement that go far beyond response times.
Thank you, Laura. Federico, I think you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Laura. What I meant is that, of course, response time is very important, but perhaps if we use some historical database, we could record how many people die because the service was not there, or what were the implications afterwards for not being there at some time. So I don't know if you have explored those options beyond just the response time, but the implications of being a little bit late, or being a little bit early, or being on time.
Yes, so I've tried to do that in some papers. We don't always have access to great historical databases. I've been looking at one right now, but mostly there's connections that you can make in the literature that look at different patient survival curves to get to answering your question and what that would look like if you optimize that versus optimizing response times. And we can retrospectively, especially with simulation, looking at one versus the other. It's a challenge because you have multiple agencies involved in the data and you have such a variety of patients. So usually we use cardiac arrest patients as like the prototypical patient. But in some applications, like in military applications, it's where they're more trauma patients, the goals are a little bit different. It's more like golden hour, getting to the hospital. And I have a recent paper on that topic as well, looking at like trauma centers. But I think there's a lot there. I think there's a lot more work to do. So I think I like where that question is coming from. I think you tapped into a really important topic.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Federico. I think Roger Rios has a question. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Laura. This is Roger from the University of Nuevo León. It was a beautiful talk. It was really enjoyable. Well, you talk all these great successful stories, but can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that you had to face when trying to sell mathematical models and operational research and business analytics to the public sector?
I think the biggest challenge, I didn't tell you about talking to the county administrators. That was not a fun meeting because they really just wanted to give the money to the school board. And they were kind of like very dismissive of, the professor. And so that was a bit of a challenge, but, in the long run, you hope that some of those conversations matter and that, it's, they have an outside expert saying like, shedding light on, if you inject some resources here, this is what the improvement could look like. And you hope that over time that can change the conversations. I worked with another agency that was, they ended up firing their fire chief at some point during the process. And I was shielded from that, but that was a challenge. So I think the biggest challenge was actually kind of getting buy-in early on from the agency. It's really like I ended up getting a bit of a reputation, and then people would call me up, but they would be very receptive to working with me. And sometimes others wouldn't be, county administrators wouldn't be so receptive. And so that was more of the challenge. And I had some issues here with Madison where it was with the 911 call center, and I got some data, but people, there are people protecting their jobs and not really sharing the data. And then you have different agencies use that data and they want answers, but they weren't all on the same page. So it can be really challenging. But if you have one really great collaborator, it's sometimes useful that they can get you what you need enough to move forward. So there's some luck in the process. You need some of the stars to align a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Roger. We have a question more specific. It's by Yuriko Fernandez. How long is the time to implement the ambulance optimization algorithms? I think this is like a more specific, maybe which are the algorithms that you use, the methods, and they take long to solve or not?
In general, many of them don't. It's the new models with they introduce some new ideas, but although some of the formulations that I've introduced are more easily solved than others. So some of the integer programming models are generally handled pretty well for the sizes that are practical for most agencies, using the state-of-the-art solvers. I think one of my papers, we had to introduce an alternative model because you're only going to send like sometimes the ambulance you want to send is not available. So you need to know who else is on the list. And we came up with a better formulation that we could solve in, a couple of minutes versus it would take all day. The recent work in stochastic programming models, those models do take a lot longer. So we worked on some studies looking at how many scenarios you would need and demonstrating that maybe a fewer scenarios that would be something that you could solve in a couple of hours would be better than adding many more scenarios. But a lot of the research is something that you could run ahead of time because you know the daily pattern of calls, and then you could program it into software. So from a practical point of view, it's all good. We can do all that. You're not really running the algorithms on the fly typically, although the dispatch questions sometimes would be something that you'd have to make more real-time decisions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we have a question from Beatriz Garcia, which is a PhD student of Roger, working with Roger and I. And she decided to work on ambulance services. And so her question is very specific because here the 991, in fact, has several, the Red Cross, the Green Cross. And they coordinate, and they often, Red Cross is coordinated or works with the 911, but not always. And so her question is, which are the decisions of coordination that are important?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can see that there's a lot of research to do on that. So that's, I've looked at issues of mutual aid, but this is slightly different than mutual aid. It's sort of like overlapping like response districts. There has been some research that's done out there. I've been looking at some questions that are not exactly that question in my research, but looking at this coordination because it's a little competitive, but also cooperative. They're trying to make a difference, and you don't want to send multiple agencies to a call because then that might lead to some inefficiencies down the road. But there are some other researchers that have answered some of those questions. Lavanya Marla at the University of Illinois wrote a nice paper about 2 years ago that studied some of those issues, and I can point out that paper offline if you email me.
Great, thank you, Laura. We have some congratulations, you can see in the chat. And Raúl Pérez is asking you that he struggles with having time for research, having time for companies, having time for government, and how. What can you say about all this time?
Yes, I feel your pain. Time management is a challenge, and it's really hard with applied research in that you don't just do the research, you have to make time for building these relationships and nurturing the relationships. And I don't know that I've necessarily figured it out, but my approach is to always pick up the phone, answer it. The answer is always yes, to have that initial conversation. And a lot of times what they want isn't really what I want to do, or they can't get me the data. And so a lot of those possible collaborations don't turn out. But if I cast a wide net and always say yes, then the really fruitful ones come to the front. So that's kind of how mostly I've worked on things. The police work I initiated, and I started making phone calls, and it was just, things worked out there as well. So being proactive can be helpful, especially if there's a really important problem that you want to dig into, if you have the right connections. But it's important to, I think, find the right balance and to kind of just keep a little bit of room in your schedule over time for these collaborations. But it's true, it does require quite a bit of time, and I can appreciate that as an applied researcher. But it also is an opportunity for making a difference. And there might have been other aspects of the question, so hopefully I answered that. Oh.
Perfect. We have a last question from Jose Luis. If you have big net cities, maybe because here in Mexico we have like small towns that are all one close to the other, and do you think that this could improve the response time if you make a bigger area for the ambulances?
Well, that's a great question. It definitely leads to larger scale problems. And it's an opportunity because if you have a region, like anybody who lives in the corner gets worse response times. And they do have a way of addressing that through mutual aid. But in general, the ambulances aren't traveling, all the way across those bigger regions. They're still kind of traveling more locally within about 20 minutes or so. But it definitely leads to an improvement. I think that where the challenge computationally comes from is if you have many, many more vehicles. And I think in the question they pointed out Uber and like taxi drivers, and those are definitely those problems scale a little bit different. And those can be very challenging to solve from an optimization point of view. So I've been thinking about that too. And in some of those applications, though, the driver has some level of control, which is interesting. But that might not be so different from questions about when do you provide EMS service to another region. But I think the question is really good, and that there was a lot of interesting research that we haven't done yet. And yeah, so I think that there are opportunities out there for sure.
Thank you, Laura. Are there other questions? You can raise your hand. Okay, well, I will ask you, Laura. We are making a great effort here in Mexico and Latin America to make more women involved in STEAM, in these operations, research, mathematics, everything, engineering. And can you say a message, something that you consider important?
Oh, that's an issue near and dear to my heart. And I think the applications that we do can serve as such an important way to attract a wide scope of new participants into the discipline. And I think it's so critical for us to broaden participation in operations research to women, but to all groups. And I've been in operations research long enough to know that it's so impactful for the discipline. Whenever we've expanded who gets to do operations research, we've studied new applications, it's revitalized the field. And so there's this big payoff for us to get there. And if we all do a little bit to reach out and to make others feel welcome, then nobody has to do a lot, and we can really take care of the operations research ecosystem in the long run. So there are simple ways you can do. I actually have a blog post on this. So I'm really excited to hear that. And it would make me happy if anybody who saw this talk is inspired to do one small thing to, broaden participation in operations research.
Thank you, Laura. One last question, and it's more technical. Edgar Posani is asking, when do you suggest to use DP? I think it's dynamic programming, and when linear programming or heuristics? Do you have an advice?
Sure. I usually use dynamic programming for the dispatch questions because those are sequential decisions to be made, and usually integer programming for or stochastic programming for the deployment, like location and which stations and vehicle mix questions. In both cases, heuristics are good. Heuristics are nice for trying to find a heuristic that mimics the Markov decision process policies is helpful because those policies aren't very interpretable. And a lot of times software that can use those heuristics, that can be really advantageous. But sometimes the heuristics are not so obvious pieces of them. And so that's where they can really add a lot of value. We want people to use our results, and if they have to solve a dynamic program or an integer program, they're a little less likely to.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, no more questions. Thank you so much, Laura, for your great talk and all the questions.